Right, hopefully all the proverbial ducks are in order at last, and see how we go. We're going to look a bit at the rise of English separatism here and how the Baptist movement emerged out of that. Now, during Elizabeth's reign, as we saw last time, many Protestants were unhappy with the Reformation in the English Church, and many complained that the Church was but halfly reformed. And the failure to promote a more thoroughgoing Protestant agenda alongside attempts to suppress Puritanism, especially those meetings called prophesyings. Prophesyings were famous for preaching, education and theological debate. The idea really came from Geneva. If you want to know who to blame for sermon class, you might potentially blame John Calvin and these kind of ideas of prophesying, where a young preacher would have gone and preached his sermon and then received feedback from the older preachers. And as I say, the attempts particularly to suppress prophesyings led some to consider separation from the Church of England. And in the early 1580s, Robert Browne, a Cambridge graduate of Puritan persuasions, became especially frustrated with regard to the question of bishops and church appointments. And he came to embrace a congregational view of church government and espoused the principle expressed in the title of his most famous work, A Treatise of Reformation Without Tarrying for Any. And again, probably it's only ever in a kind of a church context you ever hear that word tarrying, but was a good old English word. So pressing ahead without waiting for anybody to reform the church. And we also see that he's moved beyond the kind of a Puritanism that's Presbyterianism that's largely espoused by Puritans, and moving in the direction of a congregational model of church government. And he persuaded another disaffected Puritan, Robert Harrison, to join him. Now, Browne was arrested for trying to start a separatist church in Norwich in 1581, but was later freed. Browne, Harrison and their followers then set off for the Netherlands, which was now in control of the Dutch Calvinists, and they tried to establish there a thoroughly reformed church. However, many difficult questions arose, and none were more difficult than those questions surrounding the nature of the church. For Browne, the church was a company or number of Christians or believers which by willing covenant made with their God are under the government of God and of Christ. So again, the kind of principle we're beginning to see here of a covenanted community, a gathered church of believers. As a result, children of believing parents were not regarded as members of the church. Well, Harrison disagreed with this. There were also thorny questions about those who continued to conform to the Church of England, which some regarded now as an apostate church and whose members should be shunned. So if you're a member of this truly reformed church and your Uncle Fred is still in the Church of England, can you and Uncle Fred still be friends? And some were saying no, you can't have any kind of fellowship with him because he is a member of an apostate church. Eventually, Browne and Harrison clashed so severely that Browne returned to England in 1584. He was imprisoned for his views but recanted and saved himself from the hangman. And he lived out his days as a Church of England rector before being excommunicated for failure to conform to the prayer book in 1631, and he died in 1633. Someone remarked of him that the old cantankerousness remained until the end. And Harrison died in the Netherlands, where he remained around about 1585. Browne also saw himself at odds with the other two leading separatists of this generation, Henry Barrow and John Greenwood, who were associated with the Brethren of the Separation, somewhat does what it says on the tin. And they were more radical in their outlook than Browne, and saw separation not as a necessary evil, as Browne did, but as the only way in which the church could be freed from the corrupt and popish Church of England. Now, Barrow regarded Browne as a renegade, and Browne regarded Barrow as a schismatic. Again, they were at odds with each other. Barrow also favoured an elder-led congregation rather than Browne's model of the Congregationalist church. Throughout the 1580s, Barrow and Greenwood remained active and were often summoned before the authorities to account for their views. This resulted in them being imprisoned on several occasions. In 1592, they formed a separatist church in London. However, this experiment was short-lived, and in March 1593, Barrow and Greenwood were arrested for sedition, and they were hanged along with the Welsh separatist John Penry. Despite the danger, separatist groups continued to grow, some in England and some in the Netherlands. And it's out of the separatist tradition that the English Baptist movement emerged. And again, we need to bear in mind, it's not just a case of kind of going out in these days and setting up your own church. If you do that in these days, you end up meeting the hangman. So East Belfast would be, be people being hanged in it every other Sunday, if that was the case. But people, to set up a separatist church was to strike a blow, not only at the church, but the kind of society itself, because church and state are so closely intertwined. It's also an act of rebellion, where the monarch is the head of the church. So again, it's not only a religious act, it's a political act, and seen as having widespread ramifications for all of society. So we'll say these these early separatists found themselves often persecuted, and we'll see in a moment or two the early Baptists found themselves in a similar situation. Now, in 1606, a group of Puritans from the Trent Valley left the Church of England as the Lord's free people joined themselves by a covenant of the Lord into a church state. And amongst these were Thomas Helwys, who was a landed gentleman, and John Smith, who was a former town chaplain and a fiery preacher, described by one contemporary as a learned man and of good ability, but of an unsettled head. So a bit of a mad Baptist, is probably how we would term it today. Now this group, because they were Baptists, of course, they split into two groups. The reasons why they did this are actually uncertain. And by 1608, both groups were again in Amsterdam, with Smith leading one of these. Once there, Smith's congregation sought to discover their errors, to confess them, and to renounce them. And this led to disputes with the existing English separatists who formed another congregation in Amsterdam. One dispute centred on Bible translation. Smith maintained that it was not permissible to read from an English translation, as the scriptures were only inspired in Greek and Hebrew. These were typical, I think, of the debates of the day. These kind of radical earnestness or radical desire to honour God sometimes led to people dividing over what to us seem unusual issues. But here were people who were deadly sincere, deadly earnest, and as I say, sometimes that led to division. Now, this church under Smith began to distinguish themselves as the brethren of the separatism of the Second English Church at Amsterdam. So it's a good job they didn't kind of have a church website in those days. That would have been some title to kind of have to type in. Smith upheld congregational government against the Presbyterianism that was embraced by the older English separatist congregation. By 1610, a number had left the older congregation and joined Smith. Barry White, not that one, not my first year, my last year, my everything, but the famous English Baptist historian comments that such disputes underlined what was to become the fundamental Baptist concern for the next generation and more, a concern for the right establishment of the visible Church of Christ upon earth. So really this is where English Baptists and the modern Baptist movement have their roots, much more so than in the question of baptism. It begins with this, with the view of the church. What way ought Christ's church to be organised on earth? So in a sense, this is where Baptists begin, not with baptism, that comes later, but as they try to work out what it means to live as the Church of Christ while here on earth. Now, Smith's most important steps were taken then with regard to baptism. All separatists were embarrassed by the Church of England's baptism, not so much because it was infant baptism, but because it was baptism by an apostate church, and that concerned them. And so they needed to sort out this issue. Smith was increasingly convinced through Bible study that believers' baptism was the model in the New Testament church. For Smith, baptism is not just washing with water, but he said it is baptism of the Spirit, the confession of the mouth, and washing with water. And he asked how an infant could be washed with the Spirit when it has no knowledge of sin, cannot repent, and cannot confess its repentance. Also the Mennonites in Amsterdam, we've encountered them before, they too practiced believers' baptism, and this had a considerable impact upon him. In 1609 then, Smith's church was reconstituted on the basis of believers' baptism. Smith baptised himself, then Thomas Helwys, and then the rest. And he did so probably by washing their faces in a basin. So not right at the stage of baptism by immersion, but washing nonetheless. Now the fact that Smith baptised himself created a furore, as many people criticised him for what they called say baptism or self-baptism. This was a complaint that was issued against him. People argued, well, if everybody is able to baptise themselves, well then everybody can form their own church or be their own church. So people were critical of this. And to answer his critics, Smith contemplated a third baptism by the Waterlanders. That might sound a little bit bizarre, but certainly I was at college with somebody who had been baptised 3 times back in the day. He had been baptised as an infant. He had then joined a church which only baptizes in the name of the Father and the Son, because you then experience a third baptism by the Spirit. And then when he became a Baptist, he asked his pastor's advice, and he told him to be done in a proper biblical fashion. And so he was baptized by immersion in the name of the Trinity. Smith also began to adopt Arminian views. And the Calvinist Arminian conflict was at its height at this time in the early 17th century. And he rejected the ideas of original sin, predestination and reprobation. And he began to adopt ideas of universal atonement and free will. And again, these ideas may have been influenced by the Waterlanders, this Mennonite offshoot. Now, Smith's decision to seek... it's double predestination, basically. Yeah. Well, some are predestined for salvation, and some are predestined for damnation. Or as R.C. Sproul calls it, double toil and trouble. So Smith's decision to seek baptism from the Waterlanders led to a split in the church. Helwys and others felt that Smith's move towards closer cooperation with the Waterlanders was unnecessary, and so he returned to England. Smith died in 1612, not having been accepted by the Waterlanders, although the majority of his followers then joined with the Waterlanders, and the church seems to have dissolved.
Who were these guys, the Waterlanders?
Yeah, sorry, I should have said that as I was passing through, Ian. Yeah, the Waterlanders were kind of an offshoot from the Mennonites, so they were just a different Mennonite group. Okay, any other questions or comments?
So he starts off Baptist, constitutes church. He's like the first Baptist nearly, is he?
In some respects, and certainly in English terms, he's the first who kind of moves in that Baptistic direction.
Yeah. So then after that, then he adopts all these views that are contrary to what he first held. Is that right?
Well, I say he kind of finds himself embroiled really in the early 17th century. This is when the Arminian dispute breaks out in the Netherlands. So he finds himself in the Netherlands at what are, if you like, interesting times, and his theology seems to move more in the direction, a more Arminian direction, which again is probably influenced by the Waterlanders stroke Mennonites, who again have what we would classically think of now as more Arminian views. They held Arminian views before Arminius did, so he seems to have been influenced by that as well. Okay. As I say, Helwas split with Smith and returned to England. And in 1611, he returned to England and published his group published a work called A Declaration of Faith, which was a moderated and modified version of Smith's views. This declared that the Church of Christ is a company of faithful people, separated from the world by the Word and Spirit of God, being knit into the Lord and unto one another by baptism upon their confession of faith and sins. And that, I think, was kind of a very, very basic early kind of declaration of essential Baptist principles. The declaration stressed the Bible as the rule of faith, the independence of the local church, and the priesthood of all believers. This company of faithful people consisted of those baptized upon profession of faith. That argued that churches which are constituted on any other basis are not according to Christ's testament. It stated that baptism or washing with water is the outward manifestation of dying unto sin and walking in newness of life, and therefore in no wise appertains to infants. It also emphasized a number of ideas which would become key Baptist principles, such as the autonomy of the local church. Now, as I say, by 1612, Helwas and his followers had returned to England, and they established the first Baptist church on English soil at Spitalfields in London. And that same year, Helwas published a short declaration of the mystery of iniquity, and he sent a copy of this to King James I, with an accompanying note warning him not to play the role of God in the church. Now, this book is divided into 4 parts. In part 1, this consists largely of an attack upon the Catholic Church as the first beast of Revelation. Part 2 is an attack upon the Church of England for its extravagance and its liturgy, which it says tells men what to pray, when to pray, and where to pray, and what to put on when they pray. So again, I could have also spent his time writing advertising slogans, perhaps, but kind of a catchy little byline. Part 3 then is an attack upon Puritans for their failure to separate from the Church of England and their willingness to accept appointments in the Church of England. And in part 4, he attacks the separatists for their failure to embrace believers' baptism and their remaining in the Netherlands in order to avoid persecution. So he doesn't miss anybody.
Trying to win friends.
Yes.
In his follow-up book, win friends.
He's going to get hanged somewhere.
Well, I'll not spoil the plot. But now, one of the striking things about Helwas's writings is his plea for religious toleration. And it's a plea that's not only for his own group, but for people of all faiths. So he wrote, "Let them be heretics, Turks, Jews, or whatsoever. it appertains not to the earthly power to punish them. And this plea for toleration was common amongst Baptist writers at this time. And this is more than a century or half a century before other writers took up this theme. So they argue for religious toleration. I say this is unusual and quite distinctive. That people should be free to practice their religion, even where we disagree with them. Even where we think, the Puritans, have got it wrong, or the separatists have got it wrong, they should be free to do that. And indeed, people who are not Christians should be free to practice that. Now, there's kind of great debate going on today, not quite a debate, but you'll very often see it asserted today that the idea of religious toleration is in fact an Enlightenment idea that came from the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th century. But these Baptist guys prefigured that by making a plea for religious toleration. And Anabaptists, we've seen previously, did the same, making a plea for religious toleration. So this happens a long time before we find it amongst a wider body of literature. Helwas concluded his treatise explaining why they had returned to England as a group, and he said it because it was better to lay down their lives in their own country for Christ and his truth than to flee persecution. Now, we don't know two things. We don't know if King James ever received a copy of Helwas's book, or he ever read it. Certainly he would have been outraged by what he read there, because James believed he was the United Kingdom, as it were. He was the nation. He was its head, both spiritually and politically, and the whole nation came together in him. So he would have been outraged by Helwas's telling him not to make himself, or not to put himself in the place of God. So we don't know if he did read the book. We do know that Helwas was arrested and he was dead by 1616, but we don't know if he was executed or died in prison or what happened. So he may well have laid down his life for the truth that he believed in. Now, it seems that the London church continued, and by 1626 several other Baptist churches had been established at Lincoln, Sarum, Coventry and Tiverton. And we're not quite sure of the relationship between these churches and the church in London, whether they were related to that church or whether they developed independently of that. And by 1630 these various churches had around 150 members. And with the emergence of these churches, we are beginning then to see the first idea of a beginning of a corporate sense of Baptist identity. It's difficult to ascertain an accurate picture of the Baptist scene at this time, but what glimpses we do have of Baptists at this time reveal that they continued to be persecuted and despised by many within the Church of England. They were variously described as heretics, devilish and damnable, and even as atheists, those who denied the teaching of the Church of England. Okay, any questions or comments about any of that?
You just said there, David, but does atheist in that time mean denying the Church of England?
Well, it's probably less to do actually with what they believe than the fact that they're seen to be outside the Church of England. So it's just a way of, it's more a term of abuse really than technically trying to argue what they believe. Okay, just to say a little bit more then about these groups who come to be known as the General Baptists. We'll see in a moment or two Baptists come to be divided into two groups, general and particular. And we'll talk a little bit about those labels as we move along. Now, after the turbulent years of the 1630s, when bitterness grew up around Charles I's political actions, and Archbishop's Laud reform of the Church of England, the English Civil War broke out in 1642. And for the next 18 years, all England would be in a state of ferment, and nowhere more so than amongst the religious community. These were years of intense religious debates and fiery and bitter polemic. It was an era when, in the words of a popular song of the time, the world was turned upside down. And a key issue throughout the reign of Charles I had been the Church. He had resisted efforts by Calvinistic Puritans in Parliament for a more thoroughgoing reform of the Church. Instead, underestimating the strength of Puritan feeling, he installed Archbishop Laud, who was viewed as an Arminian, as Archbishop of Canterbury. And when he said he was he was claimed as an Arminian, again, he really was a high Anglican. So all Calvinists tended to see anybody who wasn't on the Puritan page as being an Arminian. So again, it tends to be a term of abuse rather than, again, necessarily a reflection on their precise theology. And Laud, on becoming Archbishop of Canterbury, set about imposing his vision of the Church upon the Church of England, and it was a vision of uniformity. His vision was the very antithesis of the Puritan vision, where he concentrated on outward ritual and aesthetics in the Church. And so, as I've said, throughout the 1630s, there's a decade of deepening religious tensions, and the 1640s bring these to a head. In 1643, Parliament, the side that was opposed to Charles I and Laud, set up the Westminster Assembly to advise them on the reform of the Church. While the Assembly represented a range of religious opinions, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Independent, and Erastian. Erastian were those who didn't care what way the Church was run as long as it was under the control of Parliament. The outcome of the work published as a result of the Westminster Assembly was largely Presbyterian in flavour. However, despite the hopes of the Presbyterians, the Church of England never did adopt Presbyterianism in its entirety. The Civil War was an era in which people really did feel the world was coming to an end, as the social order broke down, and religious sectarianism became widespread and flourished. And there's all kinds of groups emerged during this period. There's, of course, the Quakers, the Shakers, the Ranters, the Ravers, the Levellers, the Muggletonians, and so the list goes on. So there's all kinds of groups emerge at this point. And it's also an era in which the Baptists begin to flourish. And they didn't initially call themselves Baptists. Opponents, of course, called them Anabaptists, with all the kind of historical resonance that went with that. These people are crazy. But they preferred terms such as the Brethren. They called themselves the Brethren. They called themselves the Baptized Churches and the Churches of the Baptized Way. So they referred to themselves in these terms. As the Civil War unfolded, there were many Baptists in Cromwell's army and administration once he took over leadership of the country. Many of these came to Ireland, and there they established the first Baptist churches on Irish soil. Again, they were often still regarded as dangerous sectarians, and again, it was still believed that their views on baptism by many undermined the very fabric of the social order. Furthermore, the rise of uneducated Baptist preachers was also viewed with deep suspicion by Presbyterian and Church of England ministers. So of course you can't go to theological college, you can't go to Oxford and Cambridge if you don't subscribe to the Articles of the Church of England. So many of these Baptist leaders and Baptist preachers are people who have not received a theological education. They're popular preachers, and again, that becomes another reason why people don't like them and people despise them. And so you have such wonderful people as people like our old friend praise God bare bones. And again, this is how people, you know, if you want to be really holy in these days, this is the kind of name you gave your son or daughter. You know, you didn't call them John or Fred or Harry. You called them something that, you know, was fairly robust. Virtue is thy name, Smith. You know, charity is thy leader, Brown. You know, so you give them these kind of elaborate names that send out a signal that these were you were from a really godly. You were from a really
That
godly.
was a real name as opposed to a nickname.
No, that is the real name. Yep. So
Praise
it's,
God, Burton.
yep.
Smith.
Yeah. So.
Mark, you should be bringing that back.
I'm gonna have to invent one for Kilkee, yeah.
That's it. So the next time you hear of somebody who's great with child, you can suggest, ever think about praise God, you know. So
I'm going to be thinking a name. I'm not going to hear you for instance. I'm going to be thinking of a name.
now during the 1650s, then there were a number of Baptist confessions published. And amongst the general Baptists, the most significant of these was the faith and practice of 30 congregations according to the primitive pattern. And this was published in 1651. Again, this idea, the primitive pattern, again, Baptist churches are trying to get back to the pattern of the New Testament and how the church is modelled. And as significant as the first general Baptist statement to have gained widespread support amongst the churches. Despite being a confession of the general Baptists, it was not strongly Arminian and instead reflects some traditional Calvinist emphases. Indeed, it is in some part a repudiation of Quakerism, which was a growing force. And George Fox, the founder of the Quakers, drew many of his original followers from the Nottinghamshire General Baptists in 1647. There followed then a further General Baptist confession in 1660, the Standard Confession. And it contained a lengthy postscript whose aim was to allay any suggestions that the General Baptists were in any way involved in political subversion. 1660 was the year in which the monarchy was restored after the Civil War, and these people are keen to say they're not subversives, they're not politically subversive. They hold these views, these religious views strongly, but that does not mean they're seeking to subvert the crown. And by the Restoration in 1660, there's an estimated 115 congregations of General Baptists. Now, just to say a little bit about these terms, General and Particular Baptists, because we want to go on and look at the Particular Baptists now. The General Baptists are Arminian in their outlook, and the Particular Baptists are more Reformed in their outlook. General Baptist refers to their view of the atonement. They believe in a general atonement. Particular Baptists, in that more classically Reformed view, believe in a particular view of the atonement. So you'll sometimes see Particular Baptists referred to as Calvinistic Baptists. So that's the distinction between the two groups. And as we'll see in a second, that the two groups develop along different lines. They come from different roots.
With the Baptist churches here, is there many general Baptist churches in Northern Ireland?
Well, I mean, historically, the churches that were founded under Cromwell tended to be of that particular strain, and I think by the 18th century they reckoned there was one Arminian Baptist church, but again, Baptists tended to be so small, that these weren't major issues, and Baptists in Ireland tended to kind of more generally identify with the small Protestant community in Ireland. So it wasn't such a big issue. It wasn't such a big issue here. They said there were kind of Particular Baptists in Ireland. There was one General Baptist congregation, and there was one Baptist congregation didn't associate with either. So I think they must have been the original Irish Baptists. So you're not talking to anybody else. So to think a little bit then about the emergence of these particular or Calvinistic Baptists. In 1616, an independent underground congregation was founded by Henry Jacob, an associate of the separatist John Robinson. And this was founded in London. And a number of other congregations in London became associated with it. It was broadly Calvinistic in doctrine and Congregationalist in its practice. In 1630, a dispute developed in the church over a member who had a child baptised in the Church of England. So again, here's a big issue for separatists. What do you do in terms of your relationship with the Church of England and its rights? And a small number argued that the church had repudiated its links with the Church of England. And this group, led by Samuel Eaton, was allowed to leave in September 1633 and form their own stricter congregation. And Eaton himself left for New England in 1637. A further group left Jacob's church and joined them. This group may have been led by John Spilsbury, or Spilsbury may have replaced Eaton as the pastor of the first group. It's not clear exactly what happened. And at this point, their views on baptism are unclear. In the same year, another group from Jacob's church, led by Henry Jesse, who was one of Jacob's successors, left the congregation. In 1640, Richard Blunt, a member of Eaton's congregation, began advocating baptism of believers by immersion as the only true baptism. And he found support in both the congregations of Eaton and Jesse for this position. Blunt was sent to discuss the matter further with some Dutch believers who practiced baptism by immersion. And on his return, those who desired baptism by immersion were divided into two groups. It's recorded that Mr. Blunt baptised Mr. Blacklock, that was a teacher amongst them. And Mr. Blunt being baptised, he and Mr. Blacklock baptised the rest of their friends that were so minded. And many being added to them, they increased much. In January 1642, they baptised some 53 followers. And these Baptists defended their actions upon the biblical reconstruction of the church. And that was a very significant phrase, the biblical reconstruction of the faith, because this was the stated goal of the Westminster Assembly, which was to convene in 1643, that they should have this biblical reconstruction of the church. And the original church actually still exists today. It's Church Hill Baptist Church in Walthamstow, so the church is still around this time. Okay, any questions or comments before we move on a bit?
And it's still a Baptist church.
Still a Baptist, yep.
Where's
Yep.
it at? America or England?
England, Church Hill Baptist in Walthamstow. South London, is that in Walthamstow? Yeah.
Did Baptists really take off in America then? Because look at Southern Baptists and all that. Is that where really Baptists?
Well, certainly American Baptists took off in Baptists, yeah. And again, part of that, I think, really was as Baptists, you know, basically what happened in the States was all the kind of congregations and denominations from Europe simply were transferred to the States. But then what you find is that, you know, people do gradually begin to break free from those kind of older models, and as a result, many of them then become convinced of believers' baptism. And so Baptist churches begin to emerge and have the freedom to do so in the States as they kind of push beyond, you know, the original colonies and become much more into the kind of the frontier life. So you find really, I think, in the 18th century that Baptists and Methodists explode because they're not constrained by the kind of the old models taken from Europe.
Was Edward he a
Congregationalist, yeah.
When are these guys the ones that actually walked out of the Westminster Assembly?
Did they?
No, I'm just asking were they, because there were, I know during the Westminster Assembly there were some people objecting to the Presbyterian church government and they walked out.
Yeah,
these
no,
guys-
but the Baptists weren't allowed basically, and there were attempts, to try and have them discuss baptism, and they simply wouldn't entertain that. So again, the people who tended to leave the Westminster Assembly tended to be Episcopalians, who felt they owed their loyalty to King Charles, so they didn't really want to kind of get embroiled in that. And the assembly itself was divided. And actually, what you have in the end is kind of a pretty moderate Presbyterian doctrine, or kind of probably document, that emerges from Westminster Assembly. There were those who were kind of much more Presbyterian in their view, who would have loved it to have been much more dogmatically Presbyterian. But you end up with we'll talk about this a little bit later, maybe even the next session. We're kind of going to look at the Westminster Confession. We'll talk a little bit more about how that works out. But there are those who don't want to kind of get involved, but Baptists are kind of, we don't want you and your sort kind of thing at this stage. They're viewed as being beyond the pale. Okay, we're going to look then a little bit at the 1644 confession. From 1642, the particular Baptists began to grow quickly until there were 7 congregations in London by 1644. However, as they grew, they were subjected to widespread attack, sometimes in a bitter and vitriolic manner. As a result, in 1644, the 7 congregations issued the so-called London Confession, to refute such attacks and to state plainly what they believed. And its title itself is very instructive. The confession is actually called the Confession of Faith of those churches which are commonly, though falsely, called Anabaptist, presented to the view of all that fear God, to examine by the touchstone of the word of truth. So again, we're inviting you to examine this biblically, as likewise for the taking off of those aspersions, which are frequently both in pulpit and print, although unjustly cast upon them. So again, they very much see this document as an answer to many of the things that are being said about them, and they feel that many of the things that are being said about them are untrue and unjust. Now, the confession contained 53 articles and was modelled broadly upon the Separatist Confession of 1596. It was Calvinistic and contained a number of distinctive features, most notably its view of baptism. It says baptism is to be administered only to persons professing faith, and it was to be by dipping or plunging the whole body under water as a sign of the washing of the whole soul in the blood of Christ. That interest the saints have in the death, burial and resurrection of Christ and the coming resurrection. Confirmation of our faith that as certainly as the body is buried under water and rises again, so certainly shall the bodies of the saints being raised by the power of Christ in the day of resurrection to reign with Christ. So a very kind of full explanation of what they understand baptism to be. It reflects the washing of the whole person, it reflects regeneration, but above all it reflects that idea of being buried and raised with Christ. So that's at the heart of their understanding of baptism. Now, the 1644 confession was an extremely important document. Some view it as the most significant Baptist document ever, setting out the principles and practice of Baptists in a somewhat timeless fashion. And certainly it received hearty support amongst the particular Baptists of the day. It helped to crystallise exactly what was involved in being a Baptist. And furthermore, it helped to gain greater toleration for Baptists by showing that they were within the mainstream of Christian belief, and they were not the wild sectarians that Anabaptists had long been believed, or had long been believed to be. So again, here is something, does something that not only sets out their beliefs, but actually does answer many of the objections and criticisms that are being thrown at them. Now, one estimate is that there were 131 particular Baptist congregations by 1660. So they do grow very quickly over that period of 20 years or so. And in this period, Baptists become more widely accepted in the mainstream of church life, or at least dissenting church life. But they're also caught up in the maelstrom of political and social upheaval which beset England in this period. And the years 1660 to 1689 proved to be an era in which it was extremely precarious to be a Baptist. So again, it was no little step to step outside the safety of the Church of England and to be a dissenter. And many of the dissenters paid very heavily for their refusal to conform to the Church of England. Okay, any questions or any comments about any of that?
So during this sort of period, David, 1625 to 1660, so have the General Baptists start first, is that right? Then you've got the sort of particular Baptists running alongside them. General is Arminian, and General is one. Is that the only difference really?
Yeah.
One's more Calvinistic
Yeah.
and particular.
Yeah.
They seem to sort of grow up alongside each
Yeah,
other.
they
Is that
do,
what happens?
yeah, they do really. And what you find is so you really what you have is kind of, if you like, the kind of the separatist tradition,
Right.
and out of that comes the General Baptists. So they kind of emerge out of that with all that we've looked at with Smith and Helwys. But then also out of the separatist tradition, you then begin to see emerging later on the particular Baptists. And the two of them do continue on these parallel tracks, really right up until in the 18th century, the General Baptists basically collapse through heresy, for want of a better expression. They fall into Unitarianism and heresy, and they collapse. But they do kind of get a bit of a shot in the arm in the 18th century, during the 18th century revival, by what are known as the New Connection of General Baptists. But meanwhile, the particular Baptists kind of keep going and go from strength to strength until in the 1890s there's an attempt to bring it all together and give the formation of the Baptist Union, which attempts to unite General and particular Baptists, and that remains the case down to the present day. Well, at that stage it was the Baptist Union of Great Britain and Ireland, but I say it's obviously the Baptist Union today. Okay, well, we finished a couple of minutes earlier today, so you'll not object to that. And I'm not sure, what did you guys do last week in Bible Communication Workshop? Right, well, I'll be seeing you then after lunch.
What delights are we?
Oh,
Do not leave me hanging.
well, I want to keep you a quiver with anticipation. So, don't want to let
Reincarnation, isn't it?
let the how do you preach sermons on reincarnation?
Dean just dragged out